Today's Dvar Torah on Parshas Toldos is based on some Torah from the Sefer Mei HaShiloach, from the famous Rebbe of Ishbitz, whose Torah reverberates throughout the world today because of his many great Talmidim. One of them is Rabbi Tzadok Milublin, and also the Radziner dynasty. But the Mei HaShiloach is a very important sefer, and a couple of observations that we're going to make based on his Torah. First thing is that when we talk about the giving of a bracha, many of the Meforshim explain that in order to create a sense of connection between the blesser and the blessee, you need to engage all of your sensory faculties in order to be able to really freely give of a bracha to the recipient. So there has to be a complete sensory immersion in that connection between the blesser and the blessee. And we find that there was this deliberate effort that Yitzchak Avinu made in order to create that complete sensory connection between himself and who he thought was Esav. So, for example, Vayomer Hakol Kol Yaakov, he creates the auditory connection, and he says the voice is the sound of Yaakov. When it comes to the sense of touch, it says Vayemushehu, he touches him and feels his skin. And he says Vahayadai midei Esav, in the hands of Esav. He employs the sense of taste. And that's why he asked Esav to prepare for him food. And it says that Yaakov vayagesh lo vayochal, he brings him the food and he eats it. Vayove lo yayin vayesh, and he brings him wine and he drinks. That's another level of connection, using the sense of taste. And then he employs the sense of smell, when it says vayorach es reach bigadav, that he smells the fragrance of Esav's clothing on Yaakov. So certainly 4 out of the 5, you have your check mark there on the side. Yeah? There's only one sensory faculty that is not employed in the blessing of Yaakov, and that's the sense of sight. And there's a deliberate blindness of Yitzchak Avinu taking place here, which is a stark contrast to all of the other sensory faculties being employed. And that's why the Torah introduces this whole section of the blessing of Yaakov with Vayihi ki zaken Yitzchak, vatichena einav me'ra'os. That Yitzchak becomes elderly and his eyes grow dim. He's not able to see Yitzchak, to see Yaakov rather. And the question is, why is it specifically this sense that HaKadosh Baruch Hu orchestrated should be missing from the very visceral sensory experience of a blessing between the Father and the Son? Yes?
Because I think he saw his son with his neshama.
Okay. But you could say that about hearing. You could say that about other senses as well. So the question is, what is it about sight? So perhaps there's something to what, I think there's something to what you're saying, but we'll elaborate on that point in just a minute. Another observation that the Ishbitzer makes, and that is that Yitzchak Avinu and Moshe Rabbeinu are really an exercise in opposites. You normally don't hear that contrast between Yitzchak and Moshe, but let's see how he constructs it. Yitzchak Avinu cannot see, and yet he spends his whole time in Eretz Yisrael, his whole lifetime in Eretz Yisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu can see, as it says in the Torah, Alei Rosh HaPisga, go to the Pisgah Mount, Visa Einecha, and lift up your eyes, sorry, Visa Einecha, Yama Vetzafana V'Seimana U'Mizracha U'Re'ei Ve'einecha. Lift up your eyes and see with your eyes. Ki lo ta'avor ta'yarden hazeh. But you're not going in. So whereas Yitzchak is blind and immersed in Eretz Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu is sighted, can see Eretz Yisrael, but cannot go in. So what is the meaning of that idea over there? So the Ishbitzer points out something very interesting. Yitzchak Avinu represents one of the three pillars that the world stands on. You know this famous idea that each one of the forefathers represents one of the three pillars that we learn in Pirkei Avos, Al Shlosha Divarim Ha'olam Omeid. The world stands on three things: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. So Avraham Avinu corresponds to Gemilut Chasadim. Yaakov Avinu corresponds to Torah, but Yitzchak Avinu corresponds to Avodah. What is Avodah? It's the service of God, the act of doing the mitzvot. And therefore it's quite apt that Yitzchak Avinu should be connected to not being able to see, because sight is not just to visually see something, but it also represents to be able to use your seichel, to be able to use your intellect to rationalize ideas and to intellectualize Judaism and Torah. That's what sight represents, using this idea. And so Moshe Rabbeinu, who is the giver of the law, represents sight, represents the ability to have an intellectual encounter with God using his Torah, by studying his Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu has given to us. Yitzchak Avinu represents avoda, which is done many times without the intellectual engagement that is necessary for Torah study. When you serve the Ribono Shel Olam by doing his mitzvos, many times you can't even understand why you're doing what you're doing. And yet we are called upon to serve the Ribono Shel Olam regardless of whether we're intellectually engaged and stimulated through that avoda or not. And that's represented by Yitzchak's blindness. Furthermore, the differentiation between Eretz Yisrael fits in because Eretz Yisrael is the place of avoda. Everywhere in the world, wherever your intellect is the place of Torah study. But the ultimate place of avodah, of serving God completely with all Taryag mitzvot, all 613 commandments, where you can serve God most comprehensively, is in Eretz Yisrael. And so therefore, whereas Moshe Rabbeinu represents the detached intellectual Judaism of everywhere and nowhere, Yitzchak Avinu represents the avoda specifically of Eretz Yisrael. And also it can be argued that Eretz Yisrael's acquisition needs to also transcend intellect. And as I mentioned to someone the other day, if every time the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael had to think logically about the next step in our people's future in the land and in the state of Israel, and had to plan basically using logic, then we wouldn't have survived this long in the state of Israel, in modern Israel. Because everything that's happened in there transcends all logic, transcends all the entire natural order. So that's also fits into the idea of the blindness of Yitzchak, is that forget about logic. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has this supernatural protection of Klal Yisrael that transcends what logic dictates should happen. Okay, so now taking that one step further, let's see what the Ishbitzer says about why Yitzchak was blind specifically when he blesses Yaakov Avinu, even though all of the other senses are present. And he says as follows, it's in source number 6, the last word of the first line. He says, Umachmat shehashem yitbarach chafetz b'yishuv hada'at lachein hinhigo lemala mida'ato ubeirach et Yaakov. God wanted Yitzchak to have a settled mind, and therefore he elevated him above his mind. We'll see what that means in just a second. When he blessed Yaakov, using the idea that sight represents intellect, Hashem wanted Yitzchak to bless Yaakov on a super intellectual level, on a level that is above the intellect, that transcends the intellect. V'zeh haya letovat Yaakov Avinu. That was really for the benefit of Yaakov Avinu himself. Ki be'im haya mevarech et Yaakov b'de'ah v'kavana, because if Yitzchak indeed had only blessed Yaakov with focused intent, with a full knowledge of who this was and why he was blessing him, and what he was blessing him with, hayam yitbarech rak ba'ofan shema'asav yihiyu mevurarim. Then the blessing, if it was a logically directed blessing, would only befall Yaakov when Yaakov was deserving of that blessing because of his righteousness, because of his purified deeds. Lachein haya b'da'ato shehu Esav. But that's precisely why when Yitzchak blesses Yaakov, he thinks that it's Esav. I'm not blessing Esav because he's a tzaddik. I'm not blessing Esav because I am counting on him to behave in a certain way in order to deserve the brachos. I'm blessing Esav because he's my son, and I want him to have a good life, and I want him to experience the blessings of the world. V'nitbarech Yaakov af shechalila asama asim she'ena mevurarim. He says, and therefore Yaakov's blessing befell him in such a way that even if Yaakov would chalila not rise to the occasion of being a Yaakov, yitbararu l'tova. Nevertheless, the blessing would still still befall him, and would still bode well for him no matter what. Velo yidach mehem nidach, and there would never be a rejection of the Jewish people, despite the fact that in certain points in our history we are not behaving like a Yaakov. Ki chen kivein Yitzchak bebirchato ki b'da'ato shemavarech le'esav. This was precisely what Yitzchak was thinking when he blessed him, because he thought it was Esav. So basically, Yitzchak's intention is even if you're an Esav, I want the bracha to befall you. So it's the lack of sight, which represents the lack of logic, that is davka what was the Ratzon Hashem, so that the bracha should transcend logic. The bracha for the Jewish people to always remain as the chosen people should always transcend our deservedness of that bracha. And that's because God is benevolent, merciful, and righteous. And that's why God shines upon Yitzchak amidst the darkness this kind of illumination, this light. And guides him along the straight path. And that's the light that God provides to the upright. That even when they don't know what they're doing, they do the right thing and they know what they're doing. So it's a beautiful language that the Mei HaShiloach provides us with. But essentially it goes back to that whole issue of the chosenness of Klal Yisrael, the blessing that is to befall Klal Yisrael. But realize that it's only a Yitzchak who is capable of providing that kind of bracha that transcends logic. Because when you're prepared to serve Hashem, regardless of whether that avoda is intellectually satisfying and stimulating, then you deserve a bracha from Hashem that transcends the intellect and doesn't even make sense. Even when Klal Yisrael have demonstrated that we don't deserve the bracha, we still get it because of this special bracha that Yitzchak Avinu gives to the Jewish people. That's why Yitzchak Avinu in our literature, in the Talmudic literature, is known as the patriarch who can defend the Jewish people even when no other patriarch has the ability to do so. Because his whole attitude is, regardless of whether the Jewish people are deserving or not, the bracha has to maintain, the bracha has to endure throughout history. Yes?
I missed something. The bracha was intended for Esav.
Right.
Through all of this, so did he mean to give Esav this bracha, that no matter what you do, even if you don't deserve it, you should be considered?
Yes, that's precisely what he was doing. He thought that it was Esav that was going to be receiving this bracha.
So that's a separate issue then. There's two issues here. The first issue of Isaac's bracha, right? And what does it mean, and how should we see it? And the secondary issue is that he gave it to Yaakov thinking it was Esav. He gave it to Yaakov thinking that it was Esav. They're different.
No, because as I said, there was this whole sensory buildup between the blesser and the blessee.
Right, but
so that buildup remains intact. That buildup remains intact despite what Yitzchak was thinking. The blessing that is the conduit that was created through all of these connections, through the sound, the touch, the taste, and the smell, all remain intact so that the bracha goes to Yaakov unconditionally. Even when Yitzchak thinks that he's blessing somebody else.
But isn't it still wrong? Because the bracha was meant for Esau? I have a problem with this. It was meant for Esau.
That's a different question. We're not going to get into that today. That'll be for another topic as to what justification Yaakov Avinu employed in order to deceive his father. That's really what you're asking. It's deceptive. It's deceptive. It's a good question. Yes.
Not to be too cynical, but I don't see one of the senses here the receiving of money.
That's a sense. We're going back to your fundraising analogy.
I'm sorry to harp on money, but if we're talking about what is necessary to receive a bracha, and people giving out brachas, I don't see that they're touching, tasting, and hearing. I see more that they're requiring funds. Maybe
I see what you're saying.
Too much mishpacha, I don't know.
So, no, Yitzchak tells Yaakov, bring me food. That's the donation that you give to the tzaddik to create that connection between you and the tzaddik.
Well, that's what I'm asking. Is that a real thing?
It is a real thing. It is a real thing. It's not whatever he says to give, but you learn from this story about how to create a connection between the blesser and the blessee. There has to be some kind of sensory connection which involves the giving from the blessee to the blesser, something of that the blesser can utilize, can create. You have to. It's almost like there's an exchange that's taking place. In order for the blesser to be able to transfer the blessing onto the blessee has to transfer something onto the blesser. So that's why we tend to give tzedakah. We give a donation to a person that we go to when we go to a rebbe for a bracha. There is something to be said about that. Again, you have to choose your rebbes carefully, or your mikubalim carefully, depending upon who you go to. But there is what to be said about this idea of creating that connection. Yes, Patricia.
I'm just throwing this out. I know you said it was a topic for another time, but the thing that has always bothered me about this particular story with the blessing is the effect on Yaakov when he realizes he has given, on Yisroel, when he realizes he's given the blessing to the wrong person. And if you're listening to the laning in Shul, the trap that comes out when Esau says, do you not have a blessing for me, Father? It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's one of these very long traps.
Well, it's Vayecherad Yitzchak Checharada Gedola Ad Me'od.
Yeah.
And then it's a Pazer, Vayomer, right?
It's the effect on Yitzchak.
It's very dramatic. It's very dramatic.
It must have been devastating.
No, it wasn't devastating. He says, Gam Baruch Yiyah. Remember, he says, he too shall be blessed. Meaning that upon his realization that he's been conned, he says, but the bracha belongs to him. So to Yaakov. So he's not devastated, but he is filled with fright. Our sages tell us that the fright that he was filled with was this great epiphany that, boy, was I wrong this whole time? Was I wrong about Esav? That's the epiphanous moment that is so filled with drama. Not his great sense of betrayal, but his realization that if God orchestrated this whole thing, then I really must have really misread Esav completely.
That makes me feel better.
Okay, good. Lisa?
Two questions.
Yes.
One,
And then this will conclude, yeah.
do the children of the family need to be blessed in order of birth? Because that's a really bad issue in my house. Should women be blessing their children, their boys, or their kids on Friday night? To the mothers.
Well, to the first, there's no halachas in Shulchan Aruch about how to bless your children. But it probably makes sense, if there is contention or strife on this issue, to be as organized, do it in as organized and protocoled a fashion so that you avoid any strife. And then start with either the oldest and go to the youngest, or start with the youngest and go to the oldest. But choose some order so that you avoid any issues.
but each time do the oldest to the youngest?
It depends. It depends if everyone's happy and everyone's loving, then do whoever comes closest to the chair first. But if it's going to create bad feelings, so then yes, you should be ordered then. It should be done in a certain organized way. And as far as whether the mother should bless, I don't see why not. It's a beautiful minhag. If the mother has so much to give to her child, she should also be part of the bracha too. Have a great day, everybody.